Everyone. Welcome. I'm Rachel Siegel, the Director of Jewish Women's Leadership Programs at Illuminate. Welcome to our Crown Jewel Conversation Series. Illuminate empowers Jewish feminist women leaders and philanthropists advocating gender equity and social justice. We have created the Collective, our signature leadership advancement program, to train, support, elevate, and connect Jewish women's leadership globally to achieve the social change we seek. Illuminate invests in Jewish entrepreneurial women executives and leaders who are devoting their lives to tackling society's most pressing issues throughout the United States, Israel, and around the globe. Each year, we select 10 women to be in the Collective's cohort-based leadership advancement program. Our global network is now 60 women strong. Our conversation today features one of our incredible collective members. Ruth Zakarin is the CEO of the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. Ruth spent over 25 years working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence before becoming the inaugural executive director of the coalition in May 2019. Ruth has her master's in social work and is trained as a community organizer. She is particularly interested in creating models of trauma-informed advocacy. Ruth is very involved in local interfaith organizing, is an avid knitter, and is the proud mom of two incredible young adults. Please write any questions you have in the chat, and we will do our best to incorporate them if time allows. To begin the conversation, I'm pleased to introduce the immediate past president of Illuminate, Rachel Weinstein.
Thank you, Rachel, and hello, everyone. It seems so fitting that we're having this conversation today on the day that we are laying President Carter to rest, because he was obviously also a champion of gun violence. And Ruth, I'm so happy to sit in conversation with you. This is an issue which is also my personal passion. So I'm very interested and eager to hear more about your work. So how did gun violence prevention become your life's passion and your life's work?
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just also want to start with some gratitude, because I really appreciate the opportunity to be a part of the cohort and work with Illuminate in so many different ways. And some of my cohort members and friends are on the screen with us too, which I really appreciate. It's really the power of bringing women together in this way that really helps to make change in the world. So I just wanted to start with some gratitude for all of that.
Thank you.
And thank you for that opening question. It's a sort of very interesting and very Jewish story as to how I came to this work. And it really starts with how I came to working with survivors of domestic and sexual violence, and a bit about my own family history. I am the child of great-grandparents, Ida and Kalman Zakarin, who were fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe and came to the United States. And obviously there's so much trauma involved with relocation and all of the violence that they were fleeing. And I ended up growing up with stories from my grandfather, Sidney Zakarin, around how his father externalized that violence towards his family. And I was the grandchild that my grandfather decided to impart this family history to. And I learned about what it was like for him to grow up in a family where violence was occurring, and what it was like for him and his 5 siblings to feel that they needed to do things to protect their mom. And those were stories I carried with me. And not surprisingly, it led me to have a real interest in family violence and domestic violence. And when I was in school and sort of thinking about my next steps and what I wanted to do, just kept on gravitating towards these issues. I ended up getting my social work degree as well right after undergrad, and I started working in Camden, New Jersey with teen moms. And so many of them were dealing with both violence in their relationships as well as violence in the community, that it set me really on that path of this was going to be my life's work of addressing, intervening, preventing violence. And when I moved up to the Boston area, I started working in the domestic violence world and spent 25 years working with survivors. And in all the program models, from running shelter to batterers intervention, we don't call it that anymore, to community-based child trauma, all of the different program models. And for the 11 years that I worked in Brockton, which is a small city just south of Boston, we were the program that held children in the aftermath of a domestic violence homicide, which is most often perpetrated with a gun. And it was that work and sitting in such close proximity to that trauma, and there's so many stories related to that, that it got me thinking about the ubiquitous nature of guns in our society and how that escalated risk for survivors, and doing safety planning with survivors when we knew that the abuser had access to a gun. And so this piece of guns and gun violence just really started to present itself in so many different ways. And as was mentioned in my bio, I am the mom of young adults or twins who will be turning 23 on Valentine's Day. And I mention that because the day that they turned 16 was the day that the shooting happened at Parkland. And because they were so involved in USY, they had a friend who went to Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School. And so we had this moment of it's their birthday, we're about to go out for sushi for dinner, and they didn't want to leave the house until they could establish that their friend had survived this incident. This was a moment. And then the next morning, I'm driving them to school, as was my practice before heading to Brockton, and I didn't want to let them out of the car. Mm. And so that was a moment. And so I feel like all of those things kept on pointing me in this direction. And for all of the years that I did trauma response work, which was incredibly, like I wouldn't trade that experience for anything, but it also made me itchy to move a little farther upstream and think about what can we do to even prevent the trauma from happening, because response is really important. But I wanted to do something that was going to get at broader change to make this different. And so between that sort of feeling of wanting to get more involved in policy and advocacy work and all of these ways that I was thinking about the impact of guns, I feel like this was a natural next step for me to get involved in this work.
It's such a beautiful story and such a personal story. And it's just so interesting how these personal life stories, starting at the very beginning, can inform so much of what we do. Can you tell us a little bit about what the work of the coalition entails? What are you exactly doing?
Yeah, so we are the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence. And I say that because prevent is a really key term. And when we think about what that looks like, we're really trying to address gun violence as a public health crisis that is driven by racial and economic disparity. And that requires a really intentional focus on both changing policy, investing in the solutions that we know are working, and lifting up data and research to really make change. We have to do all of those things. So we got started shortly after the Sandy Hook shooting by a group of volunteers who came together wanting to think about what we needed to do in Massachusetts to prevent such a thing from happening here. And that group of volunteers did some really powerful advocacy work. We got a number of laws passed in Massachusetts that really address access to guns and the proliferation of guns in our society. And at that point, they also got some funding to start hiring staff. So I was the first full-time staff member 5.5 years ago. And now we are a huge staff of 4, but having that staffing capacity, having a really robust leadership team, we've been able to really become very focused on what the areas are that we try to make change in. So we talk about the 4 pillars of our work, and we're really mostly focused on Massachusetts. We do dip our toes into some of the national work, but our focus is on what we do here in the Commonwealth. And our 4 pillars are advocacy at the state house and municipal level, bills and budget line items that address the guns themselves, as well as root causes of gun violence. We're very involved in juvenile justice reform as foundational to violence prevention. We do a lot of community organizing focused in the communities most impacted by gun violence, so we can support what each community wants to see happen to enhance safety and promote peace. Do a lot of public education and awareness. things like movie screenings, a lot of materials that we put out into the world through social media and our website, workshops. We have a couple of different kinds of curriculum, including one for young people around root causes of gun violence and what advocacy looks like. And the last piece is, and not because of any order, but coalition building. We now have 120 member organizations from across the Commonwealth, as well as some of our national partners like Brady and Everytown and Giffords. And our leadership team is very reflective of our member organizations, really bringing lots of different folks in who are doing different kinds of work around gun violence, who are survivors themselves, who've been impacted in different ways, so that our decision making is really informed by folks who are closest to the issue.
Yeah. Are there any specific milestones that you're especially proud of in the work that you've done?
Many, gratefully.
Share some of
And
them.
it's, it's such a real privilege to be in this work and to be in community with such amazing folks. And so really one of them is the community that we've built. The work is hard, but there's also a lot of joy in it because I get to hang out with some really cool people who are really passionate about this and are doing some amazing things. So certainly that community that we have built is one of the things that I reflect on all the time. That's both a proud moment for me, but also really helps sustain me in this work. We've also just come off of getting major legislation passed in Massachusetts. So we had a very long, involved process of advocating for a comprehensive update to our firearms laws. And we did get this bill passed at the end of July with about 5 minutes to spare in our formal legislative session. And it was a real moment for me when so many folks in our coalition community came together for the bill signing, and to be able to stand with our governor as she signed off on this bill and know that we had really brought together a lot of folks to put together the wish list of what we wanted to see in this bill, but also to bring it to the finish line.
What were a few of the things in that bill?
So number of coalition priorities did get included. One is we now regulate ghost guns. And if folks are not familiar with that term, there's some nuances to this, but you can think about it in this way. If somebody buys a kit, it's shipped to them through the mail. It's up to 80% of the parts of a gun. They assemble it at home. There's no serial number, is therefore untraceable, and is considered a ghost gun. And ghost guns have become way more, there's way more of them both showing up in community. We'd also learned that some extremist groups were increasingly relying on that kind of technology to get their weapons. So we've now made it so that the kits themselves are classified as a gun, so they're not legal to be shipped into the state anymore. So that was a big accomplishment, was to get that in there. We have a whole piece around how we analyze data collected from guns in the aftermath of a crime. So trace data goes into this database. We wrote a piece into the bill to create a public dashboard so that people can see this information and understand where the guns are coming from, because we can't address the proliferation of guns unless we understand where they're originating from. And a fact that not a lot of folks know is that anytime there is a shooting in Boston, I think about this because there's actually not a single gun store in Boston. So where are those guns coming from? So better understanding that was important. We also did an expansion to extreme risk protection orders. If you're not familiar with that term, ERPO, extreme risk protection orders, temporarily remove a gun from the possession of someone deemed to be at risk of harming themselves or someone else. And we've had that on the books since 2018. But the folks who could petition for an ERPO were family members or law enforcement. We just expanded it to include mental health and medical providers, as well as some school personnel, to widen the net of folks who can access that tool. And one of our other priorities was to get an oversight committee to really look at equity and how we fund violence intervention across the state, address some gaps in funding, and just kind of zoom out and take a broader view of how that funding works to see if we can address some resource disparities in some communities that weren't getting funded well at all.
So comprehensive and such a huge win. And yet you told me that something happened. What happened?
Yeah, so we had about 2 weeks of celebration and thinking about implementation and what was going to be next. And it was a beautiful 2 weeks. And then it was great. And then we found out that GOAL, which is the Gun Owners Action League, it's the Massachusetts arm of the NRA, was going to start collecting signatures to put a question on the ballot to repeal the law in its entirety. And this set a whole chain of things into motion, and started learning a lot about ballot initiatives. But GOAL has been successful in getting enough signatures so that there will be something on the 2026 ballot in Massachusetts that will either save or fully repeal this law that we just got passed. So it's been a whirlwind of activity the past few months, learning about ballot initiatives, building our infrastructure to both fight the ballot initiative, but continue to move other things forward because we don't want to give up the rest of our work, as we're also gearing up to address this ballot initiative and lots of fundraising and infrastructure building and all of the things. And as I keep on saying to folks, we will win, we will prevail, we absolutely will, and we need to do the work to get there. So this is now a big part of our work for the next almost 2 years, is to make sure we are talking to voters and getting enough support to protect the legislation we just got passed.
Yeah, so frustrating, so frustrating. But you know, hopefully you will get that word out and it will be reinforced by the voters, and then you can feel even better about your win. So I'm hopeful that that will work out for you. Obviously, you're the Massachusetts Coalition, and your work is focused in the state of Massachusetts. How do you partner with national organizations and other states so that you can have a wider impact across the country?
Yeah, I can give a couple of different examples. So one of the really interesting things about the advocacy in the state, and this actually started years ago when we were looking at American Rescue Plan dollars, because when those were released, there was some guidance saying that those funds could be used for violence intervention. And we started collaborating with national partners like Everytown and Moms Demand Action and Giffords and Brady, Community Justice Action Fund, to convene a larger working group to figure out how we were going to get that money for violence intervention. And it started this really robust collaboration. And the coalition serves as the hub and the convener for that. So I facilitate all of those meetings with the national partners, which has been great fun, and building all of those relationships and some interesting coalition building too. And we were successful. We got a $50 million part of the ARPA funds for gun violence prevention, for youth jobs, and for reentry services, because we then built coalition with those folks too to advocate together for that funding. And then we kept that collaboration going. So when the Bruin decision, which actually came out of New York, it's a Supreme Court decision around guns and gun violence, we came together with the national partners to think about what our response in Massachusetts needed to be. And then we convened again in putting together our wish list for this omnibus bill that we worked on for the past 2 years together. So this has been a pretty core group of entities, so that we're not all showing up at the State House saying we're doing different things, but every single communication, policy recommendation, public-facing advocacy event was co-led, co-created with us and the national partners. And I think that really helped us get the legislation passed, because it was all a unified voice for everything that we did, which I think was really powerful. And now that group of folks is also coming together to support us with a ballot initiative to make sure that we protect this legislation. We just met yesterday to set up a calendar of coordinated events to educate folks about different parts of the legislation and why they're important. And then I also have a lot of contact with leaders of other state entities. And part of that is just to be of support to each other. And while the work looks very different in Massachusetts than it might in Texas, there's still some commonalities and ways that we can be of support to each other. And we really try to capitalize on creating community amongst state leaders as well. There's also a big effort happening around bringing folks in the CVI, community violence intervention world, together. So I've been involved across the country, so I've been involved with that as well. And so again, our focus really is Massachusetts, but staying connected on a national level is really important. And, we're also at a point now where we don't know what's going to happen on a national level when it comes to guns and gun violence. So having a national strategy for how we can get the work done in each state, because what every state does matters like never before, is really important.
Yeah, sort of leads me to where I was going to go next, actually, to sort of ask you if there have been any shifts in your work since the election.
Yes. One of the things that we did right after the election was to be in contact with national partners with the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention, which is, if you're not familiar with it, it was something that we have been advocating for many years. It was established about a year and a half ago, and they've been of tremendous support. And so that office is not likely to exist after a couple of weeks from now. So a lot of conversations around what this was going to look like. We brought together our coalition community for a conversation about what we think might happen. And then we've been in communication with national partners since then around, really needing to think about how we mitigate what we worry may happen with a new administration, how we continue to keep what we've accomplished strong and robust, like the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was a real game changer when it comes to gun violence on a federal level, and having a strategy for protecting that. And then also, what's happening across the country. A microcosm of that is what we're experiencing here in Massachusetts with the pushback on the law that we just passed. And so we've also been in learning with other states that are dealing with ballot initiatives to stay connected, and really drilling down about how, in light of the fact that we're worried about the national picture, it's always been important what we do in every state, and again, never been more important than now. And to have a little bit more of a focus on municipal change too, because what every city does to respond to gun violence is also critically important. And we know we can continue to make positive change in those ways.
Yeah, 100%. Why is gun violence a feminist issue?
Yeah. I don't know if folks got a chance to see the article that came out in the New York Times just recently about how the impact of homicide on pregnant and postpartum women, and that about 3/4 of those homicides are actually perpetrated with a gun. So it is now the case that the leading cause of death for pregnant and postpartum women is homicide. It's not a medical diagnosis. And the ubiquitous nature of guns in our society is, obviously it's a domestic violence issue because the vast majority of those deaths are at the hands of someone known or someone who's been an intimate partner of the victim. And then again, 3/4 of those deaths are perpetrated with a gun. And this is just one example of how, women's health issues, maternal child health issues, domestic violence, access to guns comes together in a really, really profound way. And I read that article and I thought this is my life's work all coming together in this one issue, because violence against women has obviously been my life's passion. And one of the things that is most threatening to women's safety is the ubiquitous nature of guns in our world, the fact that so many abusers have access to guns. So that is there's so many examples of why guns and gun violence are a feminist issue or a women's issue. And the other piece that I just want to lift up, and it's something that folks are often surprised to hear, is when we think about mass shootings, these shootings where you have 4 or more people in a public space, What folks are often surprised to learn is that the majority of those shootings start as a domestic violence issue. Someone's going after an intimate partner or family member in a public space or even at home, and several people are killed. There was just a horrific DV murder-suicide perpetrated with a gun in Rhode Island that essentially is a mass shooting because 4 people are dead. And also the majority of mass shooters have a history of violence against women. So domestic violence is a gun violence issue, and gun violence is a domestic violence issue. And those two issues are so completely intertwined. And that's something I'm really hoping to be more focused on is how do we connect those dots and really have, build coalition across movements and really have an intentional strategy for how we address that.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we all are hearing about those very public instances, right, of gun violence, but just, what you're saying about the pervasiveness of the small, quiet, private, in-home examples of gun violence, are endless. I do want to look at one recent public event with you and sort of unpack it a little because it happened shortly before you and I were having a call to have our pre-call for this, and that was the shooting of the United Healthcare CEO, Brian Thompson, who was shot point blank, on the streets of New York with a gun. So can we unpack that specific event a little bit about in terms of how it pertains to your work and the policy work that you're doing? Like, what are the different threads of that event?
There's a lot to unpack. So I appreciate your choice of words there because there's a lot wrapped up in this. And one is that a ghost gun was used to perpetrate the shooting. So there is a reason why the legislation, the regulations that we put in place are so critically important. And when I say that the gun laws save lives, especially to credit Giffords, it is their slogan, it is true. We know that states with stronger gun laws have lower rates of gun violence. And so that was a real moment too, when we found out that the gun that was used was a ghost gun, of just feeling like, yes, this is why we have to do this work and why we have to strengthen our policies. Ghost guns should not be a thing. So that was one piece. And then the other piece for me was, reading the news. And I'm from New York originally, so I'm always paying attention to what's happening in New York. And of course, there was so much news about this incident. And, really sitting there for a few minutes and thinking about the law enforcement response, the amount of media coverage that was happening. And of course, this is a horrific incident. I don't want to take away from that in any way, shape, or form. But I work with a lot of moms who have lost their children to gun violence and the loss of their children did not elicit the same response from the media or from law enforcement. And I work with a lot of moms whose children's cases remain unsolved and that they struggle to actually get a response at all from law enforcement. I work with a lot of moms who feel like if they call the police to see what the update is on their child's case, that they may or may not get a call back. And so I was sitting there thinking, what is it like for a mom or a parent who's lost a child to gun violence, who's not getting that kind of response, either from law enforcement or the media? And there's so much to unpack in terms of racial disparities and whose trauma gets attended to, whose stories get told. And it was just painful for me to think about how painful it must be for someone to see what law enforcement and the media can do in the situations where they choose to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. So socioeconomic disparities also, right? Right. Yeah. It's, as I think you said, it becomes an equity issue, right? Which is very sad. The issue of gun violence in the United States is far greater than any other democracy in the world. Why is that? And what would you say to those who say that, owning a gun is our civil right?
Yeah, there's books and books and books written about why gun culture and is what it is here in the United States. There's also a lot to attend to around how we're exporting our gun problem to other countries as well, which is something that I feel compelled to mention all the time, especially as we're seeing so much discussion around immigration here in the United States and folks fleeing violence. And the thing that I always want to interject is to make sure that people are thinking about the fact that a lot of the violence that's causing people to flee is actually being driven by American guns. So there's that piece as well. But there's a lot in terms of guns being connected to identity, how gun laws and how the NRA got started around who did or did not get to have access to guns, because there's a absolutely racialized history of how our gun laws have worked, and you know, all of the background about who did or did not get access to guns. And of course, the role of the NRA and the gun industry and other activists, gun activist groups, and pushing a narrative that guns make us safer and that guns are a part of identity. And of course, the data and research tells us overwhelmingly that guns do not make us safer, but those have been messages that have been hard to combat. We're working on it. We've been actually thinking a lot at the coalition about our role in pushing back on misinformation. But the gun industry has been very successful at pushing this narrative that, you know, guns are a right and guns make us safe. Interestingly enough, the folks who have come together to try to repeal the legislation we just got passed are calling themselves the Civil Rights Coalition, which I always have a hard time saying out loud because it's a little painful. And it's also just offensive. They're calling this our legislation the worst civil rights infraction in Massachusetts history, which is ahistoric. It's just also just offensive and it's racist. And so we've decided to lean into the issue of rights. And they've actually been calling us out specifically as an anti-civil rights organization. So, okay, so it's on. So we have been talking a lot about rights and the rights to be safe, the rights to not be shot.
Right to life.
So we're pushing back. We're
100%.
pushing back.
100%. I'm just going to re-invite people to put questions in the chat if you have one. I know we received one earlier, which feels like a right time to sort of ask you, you know, how do you, you know, keep your look after your own emotional health when you are dealing with so many traumatic events and so many trauma survivors in your work?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. And, you know, I'm very grateful for my family and my friends and the amount of support I have around me. I'm grateful to have found things that bring me joy. I think it was mentioned in my bio that I am a pretty avid knitter, wearing some knitting right now. And that is a very peaceful activity that I actually do think is really helpful for me. I also appreciate the value of exercise as much for my mental health as it is for my physical health. But as I mentioned before, the work is hard, but the community is strong. And there's such joy in being together with folks that I love and doing this work together. And I'm a big believer that there should be no meeting, no gathering without some laughter. We should enjoy being together. And so we really try to build in just a chance to enjoy each other and to everything that we do. And so it's this incredible community. And the other piece for me, you know, folks talk a lot about self-care for activists, and absolutely that's important. But also activism is a form of self-care, and this work is a gift for me. There's so much coming at us in the world, and it can be overwhelming, but I never feel paralyzed because every day I have the gift of being able to plug into something that feels really meaningful, even if I can't always quantify what, you know, what we've done every day, but it's very meaningful to be engaged in this work. And that's a real gift to me. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have this place to channel my energy and my agitation about the state of affairs. This is what holds it. So the work itself is what keeps me going.
Yeah, and that's beautiful. And I think it's important for us all to remember, even if our life's work is not this, but in in the moments where we feel despair, like how do you channel that energy into doing and into purpose? And I think it's a really good, important life lesson for all of us. Talk to us a little bit about the collective. As you said, I know that you have some of your collective cohort here today. How has being part of the collective impacted your leadership, or can you talk a little bit about the relationships that you've made there?
Yeah, one of the most important things about doing this work is to never feel like you're alone because the work is hard and you don't want to be the only brain thinking about things. You don't want to feel isolated in this work because that's when you can't sustain yourself. So the relationships I have in my coalition community mean the world to me. And the relationships I have outside of my coalition community mean the world to me. And sometimes it's really nice to just be able to debrief, to unload, to get support from folks who are also in leadership positions, but maybe in totally different places or with totally different issue areas. There's real power in bringing leaders together to support each other. And I do believe the sum ends up being greater than its parts because as you're bringing all of these hearts and brains together for conversations, some pretty magical things can happen. So for me, Illumina has really provided this opportunity to bring leaders together, to bring powerful women together, to support each other, but to also dream together. And I can't overestimate the importance of that.
Thank you. I was just reading, we've had a new comment come in. I live in a part of Israel where there are guns everywhere, and yet there are no episodes where people shoot up post offices or schools. Um, and there is mental health and there is poverty. So she's wondering why America has the problem of gun violence and Israel doesn't. We talked a little bit about this earlier, but are there any additional thoughts that you would want to add?
Yeah, Americans have different relationships with their guns, and guns are seen as playing a different role. And in, the United States, there's sort of a lot of sort of rugged individualism. I need my gun to protect my hearth and home. It's just a different way of thinking about guns and the role of guns than in other countries where guns are present, but gun violence is not as present. And so I think it really all comes down to guns as a part of identity, the relationship with guns, the understanding of why they exist, and whether they're a tool versus a right or a part of my identity that I get to protect myself and my family in this way. Um, and there's just been a lot written about that too. It's very interesting. It's challenging to think about how we change that. And that's why we're really trying to push back on some of this misinformation that guns make us safer. They do not.
I think back to the founding of our country also about some of the people who were sent here and also this Wild West and the whole like this idea of cowboys. I mean, guns have been part of our identity since, for hundreds of years, since the beginning of this country. And we don't seem to be able to escape that or to shift it, which is sort of sad. Um, for those who are passionate about this issue, and there are many, what can we do? Because I think that we as individuals can have influence in this arena. So what do you suggest?
Yeah, well, for anyone who's connected to Massachusetts in any way, just, please get in touch with us or follow us, sign up for our action alerts. We're going to have a lot of activity coming up. And, even if you're not in Massachusetts, but you care about this, one of the things that I've really been getting in touch with is this ballot initiative that we're dealing with is kind of the canary in the coal mine. I kind of feel like if the NRA likely feels that if they can get this done in Massachusetts and take us on, then they can do this in other places. So I do feel like there's national implications for what's happening here. So that's one way to get involved is just to follow our work and get involved with us. But the other thing that I really do encourage folks, sort of touched on the piece of misinformation several times, is to be ambassadors for correct information, data, the stories. We saw in this election the role that misinformation can play and really make seismic change. And I think we have to do a lot more to make sure that we're getting the correct data and facts out there to call for continued investment in research on gun violence, because there was a gag on that for many, many years. And so hopefully we're not going to go backwards in that way. But to equip, we've been sort of talking with our coalition community about equipping yourself with this information you can use to be ambassadors for the issue and to push back on family members or friends as they're saying things that may not be correct or maybe harmful. And so for folks to have a script for how to push back on that. And then to be aware on the federal level that some harmful things can happen, whether it's, either really dangerous laws or repealing some of the progress that we've made, or taking away funding through the CDC to actually fund gun violence prevention. We have to shout from the rooftops that that can't happen, that we can't go back, that we can't lose ground. We have seen over the past 2 years, finally, particularly this past year, a reduction in gun violence in most major cities. That hasn't always been the narrative that you're hearing. So that's the other way that we want folks to know. Shootings have been going down in most major cities, and it's because we've been strengthening laws. It's because we've had historic investment over the past 4 years in community violence intervention. We cannot lose that funding. We cannot lose ground on this issue. So whatever we can do, whatever everyone here can do to be ambassadors for the information that is correct, advocates for continued funding and research, every little bit of advocacy, once you put it all together, that's how you build movements.
And do you on your website have like a toolkit, like a fast facts, or like who to contact, or can you recommend another partner organization that would is a place that people can go to and get all that information really, in a snapshot kind of way?
Yeah, a couple of things. We're actually building up some stuff on our website. We're going to be doing some more to regular putting facts out as a part of our 2025 work. But one resource I would recommend is that every year Giffords puts out a state scorecard where each state is graded on the strength of their gun laws as well as their rates of gun violence. And so you can learn there about exactly what your state is or is not doing to address gun violence and how that's impacting the rates of gun violence in that particular state. It's a really good way to ground yourself in what the picture is for your particular state. And I'm proud to say that with the passage of this legislation, Massachusetts got upgraded to an A. So we became an A grade state based on this legislation, which we are going to protect. But it's a good resource to start with, just to get grounded in exactly what the local picture is for you.
Amazing. And hopefully you'll be the example for the federal level. A couple more questions are coming in. Do you know the stance of President Trump's new appointment to the CDC on gun violence? Has he already named that person? Do you know their stance already?
It's not great. We're pretty worried.
And how do you navigate the conversation about guns for security versus guns for support? How can we better speak to the facts, especially with friends and family who are real, Second Amendment advocates and supporters?
I'm trying to understand guns for security versus guns for support. I'm trying to understand
For
the
sport,
question, though.
for
Oh, for
sport.
sport. Got
Yeah.
it. Yeah, so, we don't touch the guns for sport. That's what folks do. That's what folks do. It's not our issue. And the guns for security piece is very tricky because, again, the data shows that defensive gun use doesn't actually create safety. The presence of a gun in your home increases risk in all sorts of ways. And when there's domestic violence, it's 5 more times to be lethal when there's a gun in the home. If you leave your guns unsecured, rates of firearm suicide and firearm suicide is actually the highest number of deaths from guns. And not everyone realizes that. But unsecured guns in the home increases the potential of that happening. Hearing that school shootings have happened because a child has actually gotten a gun from their parents, or a gun has been left unsecured in the home, brought to school, and then there's a mass shooting in school. So we just keep on referring back to that data. And as people feel unsafe, very often their response is to want to protect themselves with a gun. So that's a very real impulse. And all we can do is put out the information and the data for folks to understand and really sort of hold this core value of we do want everyone to feel safe in their homes, in their communities, in their schools. And what do we need to do to get to that place that goes beyond metal detectors in schools or hardening locations? Because that's not addressing the underlying issues. And so we just keep on bringing it back to the core of we need to come together and make broader change if we're really going to create safer communities and safer schools.
Sure. Ruth, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. We all hope that your referendum is going to be upheld and that that Massachusetts can be an example for the rest of the country. So thank you so much. I'm going to turn it back over to Rachel.
Amen. Thank you so much, Ruth, for taking the time with us to share your story, your wisdom, and talking us through a really important and complex issue. We're so proud to support your leadership and the work that you're doing. And thank you, Rachel, as always, for leading us through this incredible conversation. We have put a few links in the chat so that you can learn more about the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence and engage on this issue. And like Ruth said, stay tuned for updates so that you can continue to get involved. We hope you will save the date for our annual luncheon on May 13th and register for our next Crown Jewel conversation on February 6th with Avital Blonder, the CEO and founder of Jindas, Social Urban Vitalization in Israel. Thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you soon.